Have you ever stopped to think that, many times, the person who seems the freest is actually the one closest to falling the hardest? I discovered that in the most painful way, on the day I saw my wife trade me for a man who looked powerful, but didn't even have a bank balance. While she thought she was rising in life, I could see she was betting everything on an expensive, and dangerous, illusion. This is the story of how luxury can blind, how vanity can destroy, and how regret always charges brutal interest. At the beginning I was just the cold husband, the absent businessman, the man of numbers. In the end, I became the man she begged to come back to, when it was already far too late. If you think money doesn't change anyone, get ready to hear what it revealed in each of us. Because this story begins at the top of wealth, but ends at the bottom of regret. Stay with me until the end because the turnaround this woman will face is completely unexpected. And if you want more real stories about luxury, betrayal, downfall, and redemption, subscribe to the channel now because this one starts right now. I was only 25 years old when my name began circulating among the country's top business events. I was the young CEO everyone wanted to meet, the prodigy who came from nothing and built an empire. My companies were generating millions every month while many were still trying to pay overdue bills. I woke up on Egyptian cotton sheets and slept in rooms that looked like presidential suites. The mansion's garage looked like a showroom of imported cars fresh from the dealership. Ferrari, Lamborghini, Porsche. Each one reflecting the lights of my life of extreme luxury. I traveled by private jet the way people hail a taxi on the corner. Meetings in New York, lunches in Paris, urgent meetings in Dubai. Money worked for me while I multiplied even more of the power I already had. Everything around me breathed status, prestige, influence, and limitless growth. In the financial market, my name was treated like a brand of absolute success. Investors fought for minutes on my schedule to present million-dollar projects. My financial advisors spoke in figures most people will never see in a lifetime. I signed contracts that changed the fate of entire companies with a simple stroke of a pen. Every decision I made moved millions and created jobs for hundreds of people. I was respected by executives, feared by competitors, and admired by those who dreamed of getting where I was. I frequented rooms where only those with power, money, and influential last names were allowed. My suits were tailor-made, my watches were worth luxury cars. My image was that of an absolute winner, cold, calculative, and always in control. But behind that entire empire, there was still a man who believed in love. The loneliness of business was disguised by lavish parties and high society events. I walked down red carpets, flashes exploded, and my name echoed through the halls. Imported champagne, marble tables, people who smiled at me only for what I represented. I had access to everything money could buy, without exception. I could enter the most exclusive places in the world without having to explain who I was. All it took was my last name, my black card, and the certainty that I could pay any price. But none of those things completely filled the silence of my late nights. Despite the empire, I still had dinner alone many times in front of giant windows. The glow of the city lit my face while I wondered what was still missing. I had everything, except someone to share that golden universe with. My routine was a sequence of billion-dollar meetings, private flights, and strategic decisions. I managed companies while people my age were still searching for their first job. My phone buzzed all day with numbers that would terrify any ordinary person. Transfers, investments, profits growing as if there were no ceiling. My accountant said I was a rare case even among millionaires. I was becoming a potential billionaire while the market speculated about my next moves. Every choice I made became a headline in financial news outlets. I was an example of success, discipline, and above-average ambition. But in the middle of all that, I felt an emptiness that not even money could fill. An emptiness I still didn't know how would change my destiny. Inside the mansion, everything was automated, silent, and almost too perfect. Gates that opened on their own, private elevators, cameras everywhere. Armed security 24 hours a day to protect my assets and my life. Pools reflecting lights like mirrors of a world inaccessible to many. Wine cellars with rare bottles, works of art in every hallway, couches worth more than apartments. My home was a public symbol of my meteoric rise. But inside, it often echoed empty like a great vault without emotions. I walked through those corridors feeling that something needed to change. Professional success was absolute, but the emotional side was still unresolved. And it was exactly when that void started to bother me that everything changed. I always said I had no time for romance, only for business. I believed love could interfere with cold, strategic decisions. I watched many colleagues lose fortunes because of choices made with emotion. I promised myself I would never mix feelings with assets. My focus was to grow, dominate markets, expand companies and consolidate empires. But destiny has an ironic way of testing our certainties. Right when I believed I was immune to any emotional distraction. Right when I thought control in my life was absolute. Something began to move behind the scenes of my own destiny. And I had no idea who was about to step into it. My nights began to grow longer and quieter. The noise of business faded, but the noise of conscience grew louder. I asked myself whether all that money truly made sense on my own. Friends were few, almost all interested in what I represented. Relationships were shallow, based on interest, status, and convenience. I saw happy couples at events and felt a twinge of curiosity. Not envy, but the desire to live something different from the coldness of contracts. A part of me began to long for something money cannot buy. Even surrounded by luxury, I began to crave real connection. And it was at that exact moment that my path crossed with hers. I still remember how that day seemed like just another ordinary engagement. Another luxurious event, another night surrounded by important people. Nothing seemed to indicate that something would truly change in my life. My driver simply said it was another high society party. I stepped out of the car adjusting my jacket, ready for empty smiles. But something inside me felt that night would be different. As if the universe were preparing a strategic encounter. An encounter that would change my story forever. I didn't know it yet, but my life of luxury was about to gain a new center. And that center had a name, a face, and a destiny dangerously intertwined with mine. It was on a night that, at first, seemed like just another high society gala. The hall was filled with long gowns, sparkling jewelry and expensive perfume in the air. Crystal chandeliers reflected in champagne glasses as if money itself had taken shape. I walked among businessmen, politicians and heirs of powerful last names, greeting them one by one. To me it was just another place where I was seen as the young prodigy CEO. People came up to me to talk about business, investments and million-dollar partnerships. But that night, for the first time in a long while, I didn't want to talk about numbers. My eyes wandered through the room as if searching for something I couldn't define. It was in that moment, as the DJ changed the music and the lights softened, that I saw her for the first time. And for 1 second all the noise of the room seemed to disappear. She was leaning against one of the marble columns, holding a champagne glass as if she had been born there. Her dress hugged her body with elegance, not excessive, but enough to draw anyone's attention as they passed. Her diamond earrings reflected the light of the room, and yet her eyes still shone brighter. It wasn't just beauty, it was presence, it was energy, it was something that couldn't be explained logically. She laughed at something a friend said, and I realized half the men in the room had already noticed that laugh. But there was something different in the way she observed everything around her, as if the luxury didn't impress her. It was as if she were already part of that world, and at the same time didn't fully belong to it. I, who had always analyzed people like I read reports, felt there was something there outside the curve. She wasn't just another pretty face in an expensive dress. She was someone who, in some way, seemed dangerously interesting for my kind of life. One of the hostesses noticed my fixed gaze and came over with a mischievous smile. She knew that nothing in that environment happened by chance, neither meetings nor introductions. "You need to meet someone," she said, as if offering a great opportunity. I was already used to being introduced to influential people, but this time the knot in my stomach was different. As we walked through the room, I tried to keep the neutral expression of an unshakable CEO. Inside, however, I felt a curiosity I hadn't felt for anyone in a long time. With every step, I saw her getting closer, still unaware that I was the destination of those words. When we finally stood face to face, the hostess said my name and then hers. She smiled calmly, without any desperation to impress. And in that smile, I understood that the most dangerous deal that night would be emotional. "So you're the famous young millionaire everyone talks about," she said, laughing softly. The way she said it carried no flattery, only a gentle provocation. I replied that millionaires in that room were not rare, but sincerity was. She raised an eyebrow as if she liked the answer and took a sip from her glass. We began talking right there, standing in the middle of people discussing stocks and real estate. With her, however, the conversation went somewhere completely different. We talked about trips, memories, fears, dreams that didn't fit into an Excel spreadsheet. She seemed to understand the weight of living surrounded by luxury, and at the same time miss simple things. I, used to being seen as a walking vault, felt seen as a person. And that, for someone in my position, was rarer than any diamond in that room. As the music shifted to something softer, she suggested we go out to the balcony. Outside, the view of the illuminated city looked like a sea of liquid gold. The wind gently touched her hair, and for a few seconds, I forgot any meeting scheduled for the next day. She rested her arms on the railing and asked if I was truly happy with that life. No one ever asked me that kind of question, especially not in a place like that. Usually they wanted to know how much I earned, what I drove, where I invested. With her, the question was different. How much of all this really makes sense to you? I gave a short laugh, more to mask it than because I found it funny. I replied that money buys almost everything, except the feeling of being complete. She looked at me sideways in silence, as if she had found a crack in my glass castle. On that balcony, between toasts and superficial conversations in the background, we created a bubble of our own. She said she had always moved in that universe of luxury, but never let herself be defined by it. She talked about seeing many people lose themselves trying to prove something with cars, jewels, and mansions. I listened to every word as if facing a mirror that showed me things I avoided seeing. It was frightening and comforting at the same time, as if someone had read my most intimate notes. When I spoke, she listened in a way no one else ever did. There was no calculation, no interest in the backstage of my wealth. She asked about the boy I was before becoming the CEO everyone knew, and I caught myself telling stories I shared with almost no one. It was then I realized, I hadn't felt so human in a very long time. The hosts began announcing a toast in the center of the room, calling everyone back. She made a move to go, but before that she looked at me and asked if I believed in coincidences. I replied that, in my world, nothing was coincidence, everything was strategy. She laughed and said that sometimes the universe arranges meetings that even the best strategists could never predict. We returned to the hall side by side, and I noticed the looks in our direction. Some curious, others evaluating, as if another high-value negotiation were taking place. But for the first time I didn't care what they thought. While glasses were raised and speeches were made, I only paid attention to her. To the way she held the glass, the way she listened, the way she moved among people. It was as if the entire hall had shrunk into a secondary backdrop. After the toast, a slower song began to play, and many couples went to the dance floor. I had never been a fan of that kind of public emotional exposure, especially being who I was. But that night, something was different in me, as if I had left my CEO armor at the door. I looked at her and, before my courage evaporated, I extended my hand. "May I have this dance?" I asked, half joking, half serious. She hesitated for a second, as if carefully weighing my invitation. Then she smiled and placed her hand in mine. At that moment, the luxury around us stopped being scenery and became just background noise. As we danced, I had the strange feeling that I was beginning something significant. Something that wouldn't fit into any contract, clause, or spreadsheet. From that night on, my life stopped being only about companies, profits, and expansion. She began to occupy spaces I didn't even know were empty. Late-night messages, discreet meetings, dinners at restaurants where the waiter already knew me by name. I loved watching how she moved naturally between luxury and simplicity. We could be in a Michelin star restaurant or grabbing something quick on the way home. She seemed to fit into every environment, but somehow she fit best by my side. I, who had always seen the world as numbers, began to see everything in different colors. Instead of thinking only about profits, I began to imagine the future, family, continuity. She made me believe that love could exist even in the middle of so much money. And that blend of romance and opulence was, step by step, moving toward something even greater. Our wedding was announced as one of the most luxurious events of the year. Society magazines competed for every detail, every guest, every inch of the venue. The ceremony took place in a space surrounded by immaculate gardens and cinematic lighting. She walked in to the sound of a live orchestra, wearing a dress worth more than many houses. I waited for her at the altar in a custom-made suit crafted in Europe. Drones hovered above, recording everything for exclusive reports. Executives, politicians, celebrities, and heirs of the elite filled the seats. Every gaze had to admit that this was no ordinary wedding. It was the union of beauty, status, and financial power in its most visible form. And I truly believed I was living the happiest day of my life. The celebration that followed felt like a film about limitless wealth. Tables decorated with imported flowers, French crystal, and custom plates with our initials. The champagne cost more than the annual salary of many people. International chefs commanded the kitchen as if they were on a television show. Guests moved around in awe of the level of extravagance. She smiled constantly, being photographed from every possible angle. I saw happiness in her eyes, and it fed my pride even more. That beautiful woman was now officially my wife in the eyes of society. Everyone toasted to our love, our future, and the strength of our union. And I believed that nothing could shake what we were building. The honeymoon was a chapter apart in our life of extreme luxury. First Paris, then the Maldives, then Dubai, all on the same itinerary. Presidential suites, private helicopters, dinners by the sea. She woke up to breakfast served on silver trays with an ocean view. We toasted at sunset as if the world belonged only to us. We posted photos in places many people only ever see on computer screens. I made a point of giving her everything money could buy. I wanted her to feel like the most privileged woman on the planet. And honestly, I believed that was giving love in its purest form. At that moment, I saw no limits to what we would still live together. When we returned, our new routine looked like it came straight out of a luxury catalog. She moved in with me at the mansion that had once echoed empty. Entire closets were prepared for her designer clothes. Lit shoe cabinets, jewelry arranged like store displays. New cars appeared in the garage like gifts for dates that didn't even exist. Private security followed our every move. Private drivers took her wherever she wanted to go. I felt proud to be the man who could offer all of that. Proud to see her treated like a queen in front of everyone. And proud to believe that luxury was the foundation of our happiness. Our weekends became a sequence of exclusive parties. Yachts anchored on private beaches, secret gatherings of high society. Influential friends, powerful businessmen, toasts and deals by the pool. She was always flawless, made up, dressed in brands many only saw in display windows. I watched how perfectly she adapted to that world. It seemed as though she had always belonged to that scene of money and power. The looks of envy were constant, especially from other women. I enjoyed that feeling of being the luckiest man in the room. A millionaire CEO with a stunning wife by his side. Everything looked like an endless commercial of success and fulfillment. Over time, the exposure began to grow even more. She started being invited alone to events, fashion shows, and inaugurations. Her name began appearing in society columns more and more often. I saw that as the growth of our image as an elite couple. I thought we were climbing the status ladder together. She loved being photographed, praised, talked about. I found it beautiful to watch her confidence grow in that universe. It never crossed my mind that this could change anything between us. To me, it was simply the natural reflection of our life of luxury. I trusted too much in what we had built up to that point. Inside the house, I tried to be much more than just a provider. Even with a packed schedule, I made a point of being present. Dinners together, trips for 2, late-night conversations on the mansion's balcony. I wanted to be a husband, not just a businessman in the relationship. I talked about children, about the future, about the continuity of our legacy. She smiled, agreed, made plans with me. Everything seemed aligned, harmonious, almost too perfect. Contracts could fail, but I believed the marriage was solid. I saw no cracks in that glass castle. I never imagined that behind those smiles, something was already beginning to tilt. The money kept coming in, the businesses prospered like never before. And I went on multiplying assets while believing I was multiplying love. Every new contract I closed seemed like a gift to her as well. Every victory of mine I made a point of sharing with pride. She celebrated by my side in every success, in front of cameras and guests. I believed we were a team, a perfect partnership inside and outside the home. A couple that represented everything many people dreamed of living. Wealth, beauty, power, stability, and social visibility. But silently, something began to change in the way she looked at me. And I still wasn't ready to see what was coming next. That fairy tale financed by millions seemed indestructible. I slept peacefully believing I had conquered everything a man could desire. A strong company, million-dollar accounts, public recognition, and a wife admired by all. My world seemed too complete to be real. And perhaps precisely because of that, I didn't notice the first warning signs. The luxury routine began to take on new habits, new absences. Small details that I, too busy with business, began to ignore. Everything seemed just a natural part of elite social life. But deep down, the stage was already being prepared for something I would never imagine living. And that change would begin to appear in an almost imperceptible way. After the wedding, I immersed myself even more in the role of a provider husband. I wanted her to never lack absolutely anything. My credit cards became an extension of her well-being. If she wanted something, all she had to do was say it, and that same day it was purchased. Jewelry, designer clothes, imported handbags, exclusive shoes. I took pleasure in seeing her happy through the comfort I could offer. I saw that as care, as love in the form of financial stability. While I closed million-dollar deals, I thought of her as my priority. Every decision in business also took our future into account. I wanted to be the unshakable foundation of her life in every sense. Travel became even more frequent after the wedding. Paris for shopping, Milan for fashion shows, Dubai for rest in 7-star hotels. I adjusted my CEO schedule to accompany her whenever possible. When I couldn't, I made a point of leaving everything even more comfortable. Private driver, armed security, exclusive concierge. No detail was too small when it came to her well-being. I held video meetings from private airports and presidential suites. Sometimes I closed deals while she rested beside me. I looked at that scene and thought that was true success. To work hard and still be present as a husband. At home, I tried to be more than just a man of numbers. I prepared special dinners when I managed to get home earlier. I lit the garden lights, ordered refined dishes, and chose rare wines. I wanted every night at home to feel like a celebration. She arrived dressed up, perfumed, and I always welcomed her with affection. We talked about the day, the events, the projects, the plans. I listened to her attentively even when I was exhausted. Because to me, listening was also part of providing. I believed presence was just as important as money. And I made an effort not to let work take that away from me. I also made a point of investing in her image. I knew the elite world is cruel to those who can't keep up. I hired a stylist, personal trainer, nutritionist, everything at the highest level. Not as an imposition, but so she would feel confident and valued. She loved the care, the transformations, the constant compliments. I thrilled at seeing her even more beautiful and self-assured. I thought I was building an even stronger woman by my side. It never crossed my mind that this could push us apart. In my logic, the more investment, the stronger the relationship became. I saw no risk where I only saw growth and prosperity. Nothing was ever lacking inside that mansion. Staff, maids, housekeepers, gardeners, security guards. Everything ran like a Swiss watch. She woke up to breakfast in bed whenever she wanted. There were days when she didn't even need to step outside to resolve anything. I made sure her only concern was being happy. While I dealt with enormous pressures behind the scenes of the companies, she lived shielded from any financial difficulty. That, to me, was the ultimate meaning of love. To love was to sustain, protect, make things easier, shield from the world. I made constant surprises to keep the spark alive. Gifts outside of special dates, unexpected dinners, surprise trips. Sometimes I returned from international meetings just to spend one night with her. I arrived tired, but with my heart full of intention. She smiled, thanked me, hugged me, but little by little something seemed different. The hugs began to grow shorter. The thank yous more automatic. I noticed, but I blamed it on fatigue, routine, overexposure. Never on the end of love. Never on the possibility of being silently replaced. I also defended her in everything. If anyone criticized her, I was always by her side. If there were malicious comments, I neutralized them with my position. My influence protected not only my assets but also my family. She had full backing in my name, in my power, in my empire. And I took pride in that. Pride in being the man she could call her husband in front of everyone. Pride in sustaining a standard few in the country could reach. Pride in being an example of marital and financial success. Even without knowing that I was feeding something slipping beyond my control. Meanwhile, my businesses kept growing nonstop. New acquisitions, new companies, new million-dollar investments. I was becoming more and more powerful in the market. My name became synonymous with rapid growth and solidity. And I shared every achievement with her like a trophy of our love. But the higher I climbed in business, the more distant she seemed at home. I tried to compensate by doubling the care, the gifts, the trips. Without realizing that not everything can be bought with a bank balance. Without noticing that something essential was beginning to slip through my fingers. And that silent change was only just beginning. Little by little, I began to notice details that hadn't existed before. More time away, more events without my presence, more subtle secrets. They were still small signs, almost invisible in the luxury routine. But they began to repeat themselves. I, too busy with figures, postponed the concern. I told myself it was all in my head. That we were in the best phase of our lives. That nothing could threaten a marriage built on so much abundance. But her behavior was beginning to change in an almost imperceptible way. And that change would open the door to something I could never have imagined living. It was in an almost imperceptible way that I began to notice the first changes. At first, they were just small delays, vague excuses, more hurried glances. She started spending more time outside the house, always saying she had social commitments. Events we used to attend together became just hers. Fashion shows, openings, high society dinners without my presence. I, busy with board meetings and billion-dollar negotiations, accepted it without questioning. After all, I trusted her blindly. I believed momentary distance was something natural in such intense lives. It never crossed my mind that it could be the beginning of an affair. But the frequency of those absences began to increase. She also became even more meticulous about her appearance than she already was. New cosmetic procedures, bolder clothes, different perfumes. She spent hours getting ready even when she said she was just going to the gym. The mirror became a constant ally in her routine. Photos began appearing on social media with increasingly provocative angles. I thought that was simply part of the fashion and elite world. After all, that environment lives on image, appearance, and status. But something inside me began to feel a slight discomfort. As if one piece were slightly out of place in the puzzle. A silent discomfort that I insisted on ignoring. New friendships also began to appear out of nowhere. People I had never heard of became part of her routine. Influencers, mysterious businessmen, figures who moved through the elite by appearance alone. She talked about those new friends with unusual enthusiasm. She laughed at their stories, mentioned names, places, meetings. Meanwhile, our conversations at home became increasingly shallow. What used to be dialogue turned into quick exchanges of information. I talked about companies, she replied distractedly. She talked about events, I listened as someone outside that world. The connection we had was beginning to show noises that were hard to explain. The luxury gym became the new center of her life. Exclusive personal trainer, workouts at odd hours, private classes. She left the house impeccable to work out, and returned hours later. Always physically tired, but with a strangely light expression. She began exchanging messages on her phone late into the night. She quickly turned the screen away when I approached. She said they were just gym friends. I smiled, agreed, but something inside me began to grow uneasy. I had never been a suspicious man, but that was outside the pattern. Small secrets began to pile up in the silence of our routine. I also noticed that she began to show less interest in me. Touches became rarer, looks more distant. Our nights together started to decrease without any clear explanation. Deep conversations gave way to short, automatic answers. I tried to stay close, but I felt something pulling her away. She always seemed to be in a rush, even without urgent commitments. I asked if something was wrong. She assured me everything was fine. She said it was just tiredness, too much on her mind. I believed her because I wanted to believe. But the feeling of a silent loss began to settle in. Even so, I continued to trust her completely. I chose to believe that everything was part of a phase. That the exposure, the luxury, and the new routine were just demanding adaptation. I doubled the care, the gifts, the attempts at closeness. I thought that by showing even more love, everything would fall back into place. I never thought about spying, suspicion, or surveillance. Betrayal was a word I never associated with our marriage. In my mind, we were protected by everything we had built. Money, power, status, and stability seemed like impenetrable shields. But in practice, I was only postponing the truth. Some nights I stayed alone in the mansion, waiting for her to return. The clock passed midnight and no message arrived. When she did arrive, she came tired, evasive, with ready-made excuses. I welcomed her with affection, even as my heart felt tight. She gave me a quick kiss, went upstairs to shower, and went to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening. I remembered everything I did for her and wondered where I was going wrong. But I always reached the same answer. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Even so, something was slipping beyond my control. And that uncertainty began to silently eat away at me. As the days passed, the signs became more evident. Changes in perfume, clothes I had never seen before, defensive answers. She began to overly protect her phone. She set new passwords, muted notifications, stepped away to take calls. I pretended not to notice, but all of it was recorded in my mind. My rational side told me to investigate. My emotional side begged me to trust. And I chose to trust, even with my inner alarm screaming. I chose to believe my marriage was still safe. Not knowing that the truth was already circulating much closer than I imagined. The atmosphere inside the house began to change in a subtle way. The silence grew heavier, the spaces more distant. That home that once pulsed with partnership now seemed divided by invisible walls. I still tried to maintain the harmony, but something had already shifted. She no longer shared her routines with me as she once did. Transparency had given way to a haze that was hard to cross. Even so, I continued believing it was just a phase. I didn't imagine that something much worse was forming beyond my reach. And that this change in behavior was only the entry door. For someone who would soon cease to be just a suspicion. I only understood who was really entering our story much later. At first, he was just another name mentioned vaguely in her conversations. A gym acquaintance, an event friend, someone who knew a lot about image. She spoke lightly, as if he were too insignificant to draw attention. But little by little, that name began to repeat more than normal. Always associated with workouts, exclusive parties, and exposure opportunities. I, unaware of the social backstage of that world, didn't give it real importance. To me, it sounded like just part of the elite environment and nothing more. Little did I know that this man was already circulating through my home indirectly, and that my money was already financing, without my knowing, part of his life. He was exactly the kind of person who blends easily among the wealthy. He lived off appearances, borrowed status, and fabricated influence on social media. He posted photos in cars that weren't his at parties where he was only a guest. His speech was that of a successful businessman, but reality was very different. He claimed to have investments, companies, international connections. But everything was sustained by loans, favors, and opportunism. A character built to look like part of the financial elite. The kind of man who survives on illusion in a world that values real numbers. I only didn't notice because I trusted too much in the stability of my own life. I never imagined someone like that could infiltrate my marriage. She began to admire everything he said. She repeated phrases I had never heard from her before. Talked about living intensely, following the heart, not being tied to money. Precisely to me, a man who built everything exactly through money. That shift in her discourse sounded strange to me, but I still didn't connect the dots. She seemed enchanted by a free lifestyle he sold. A lifestyle that, in practice, was sustained by others. Among them, without her knowing at the time, myself. Because much of the standard he displayed came indirectly from what left my account. And that made everything even more cruel. He began to frequent the same environments we did. The same events, the same parties, the same exclusive circles. Always at a distance, always as someone who watches before striking. I saw him, but I didn't know who he really was. A handsome face in the crowd of influential people. Just another one seeking space among millionaires. He observed my wife like someone studying a target. While I held her hand, without imagining who was surrounding us. That silent game was happening right before my eyes. And I went on completely blind with trust and routine. Over time, he drew closer in a strategic way. First as a personal trainer, then as a mentor, then as a confidant. He entered her life through vanity, admiration, and ego, and moved from the backstage straight into the center of her emotions. He listened to complaints I didn't even know existed. He agreed with everything, validated dissatisfactions, fed hidden desires. While I validated with actions, he validated with manipulated words. And many times words carry more weight than gestures. I sustained the structure and he worked to undermine the foundations. A silent, patient, and very well-calculated effort. She began to defend him naturally. Whenever I questioned something, she cited him as an example. Fulano thinks I deserve to live more. He says I'm too held back. His name started to appear in our dialogues like a constant shadow. And I, without realizing it, was already being compared. Compared to someone who carried not even 1% of my responsibilities. She spoke of him with a sparkle in her eyes and spoke of me with routine in her voice. That began to wound me in a silent way. Still, I believed it was just passing admiration. I didn't see a triangle there. I saw only an innocent distraction. Her behavior when receiving messages changed completely when it was him. Her face lit up, the smile appeared without her noticing. She left the room to reply, came back different. Light, excited, absent from what was in front of her with me. I noticed but swallowed it in silence, trying not to seem controlling. I, who always valued freedom, didn't want to be that suspicious husband. But the truth is that the space between us was being occupied by another. An emotional space I thought was still mine. While my world revolved around figures, hers began to revolve around him. And this was only just beginning to intensify. While I closed new million-dollar contracts, she closed new hidden encounters. While I expanded companies, she expanded secrets. While I guaranteed stability, someone else offered emotion. An unfair, unbalanced, and invisible game to me at that moment. Little did I know that behind the smiles and the seemingly normal routines, she was already emotionally involved with another man. A man who pretended to be powerful but in truth had nothing solid. A man who needed her as much as he needed the money I indirectly provided. But at that stage I was still only the unconscious financier of that theater. Without imagining who was benefiting from my own trust. The environment around us began to change in a strange way. Conversations stopped when I arrived, glances were avoided, answers became quick. Something was already wrong on a much deeper level than I could see. His name was already infiltrated into our marriage. Even though I still didn't truly know who he was. But destiny was already preparing the reality shock that would change everything. And that gym acquaintance was about to become something much bigger. Something that would step out of the shadows straight into the center of my life. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same again. because the truth was only waiting for the right moment to meet me. That day began like any other in my routine as a CEO. I woke up early, reviewed the numbers, closed a $1 million acquisition before 10 in the morning. My mind was focused on profits, expansion, and new international contracts. I still believed that everything at home was under control. I sent her a loving message before my first meeting. She replied dryly, unlike her usual self. It caused me slight discomfort, but I went on with my day as normal. Meetings, calls, decisions worth millions. Nothing indicated that, just a few hours later, I would lose control of the only area of my life I thought was indestructible. My marriage. In the middle of the afternoon, a meeting was canceled at the last minute. A rare thing in my executive schedule. I took the opportunity to return to the mansion without warning. I wanted to surprise her, maybe take her out to dinner. The electronic gate opened slowly, revealing the silent garage. None of her cars were there. That was strange because she had said she would stay home that day. The clock showed just after 4 in the afternoon. The sky was clear, far too calm for the chaos I was about to live. Something inside me began to tighten for no logical reason. I entered the house without announcing myself to the staff. The silence of the mansion felt heavier than usual. I went up the stairs slowly, feeling a strange premonition grow with each step. I passed by our bedroom and noticed the bed was untouched. The closet was open and some clothes were no longer in their usual place. A different perfume lingered in the air, something I didn't recognize as part of our routine. My heart began to race off rhythm. I went back down and headed to her office. The door was closed but not locked. And that was where I saw something that would change everything. On the desk, her phone was vibrating insistently. The name on the screen was not mine. It was that same name that had been repeated over the past few months. My body froze for a few seconds as if I were standing before an invisible cliff. I had never invaded her privacy. I had never needed that in order to trust. But in that moment, something stronger than my principles spoke louder. I touched the screen with trembling fingers. The messages were open, far too explicit for any doubt. There was no longer any room for interpretation. Every sentence I read was a silent stab. Plans for meetings, declarations of desire, promises that were not meant for me. Photos that should never have existed within a marriage. I stood there, motionless, reading the living proof that I had been deceived. My corporate world had always been made of calculated risks. But that was a loss I had never considered in my life's portfolio. My hands were sweating, my vision growing blurry. I tried to breathe, but it felt as if all the air had drained from the entire mansion. The coldness that had always defined me in business evaporated in seconds. I was just a betrayed man staring at a phone screen. The messages made it clear that they had a meeting scheduled for that afternoon. A 5-star hotel in the city center. The same one I had already used for meetings with foreign investors. The time was there, cold, objective, marked like any ordinary appointment. My mind refused to accept it, but my body had already reacted. I grabbed my keys without making a sound. Got into the car without anyone noticing. The engine growled softly as I left the garage like a ghost. I drove without music, without calls, unable to think straight. I just followed the address as if walking toward my own emotional execution. Traffic seemed far too slow for the desperation consuming me. Every traffic light was torture. Every car ahead seemed to mock my haste. My mind shifted between disbelief, rage, and a deep sorrow. I remembered everything I had done for her. The trips, the jewelry, the nights waiting awake. And now I imagined her in another man's arms. A man I barely knew, but who now occupied a space that was mine. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in the steering wheel. The hotel building rose before me like a silent judge ready to deliver the sentence. I handed the car to the valet without looking at him. I entered the lobby like just another hurried executive. The carpet, the chandelier, the background music, everything felt far too normal. My world was collapsing inside while the rest of the world kept on turning. I asked for information at the front desk with the firm voice I used in business. The employee gave me the floor without suspecting anything. I entered the elevator alone. Each floor I passed seemed to tear away a piece of my innocence. My reflection in the mirror showed a man cold on the outside and in collapse on the inside. And when the doors opened, I knew there was no turning back. The hallway was far too silent. I walked toward the door indicated in the messages. My entire body was trembling, but my hand moved firmly to the doorknob. I still held on to the hope that all of it was a terrible mistake. That I had interpreted something wrong. That my world was still intact. I rang the doorbell once. The sound echoed inside me like a gunshot. I heard footsteps approaching on the other side. And in that second before the door opened, my life as I knew it came to an end. The door began to open slowly. The first thing I saw was the look of panic on her face. Then, behind her, the silhouette of a man trying to cover himself in a hurry. The room, the clothes scattered on the floor, the entire scene screaming what my words didn't need to ask. Time seemed to stop for a few seconds. No one said anything. There were no possible justifications in that heavy silence. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't move forward. I only observed that scene with eyes filled with a pain I had never felt before. And in that exact moment, something inside me died, while something else, far colder, began to be born. The door had barely finished opening when the silence between us became unbearable. She stood frozen, covered only by a sheet, her eyes wide with panic. I felt my entire body tingle, as if the floor had disappeared beneath me. The lover behind her tried to put on his shirt with trembling hands. The whole scene looked like a bad movie, but it was my life there, in pieces. I took a deep breath to avoid losing control, something I had always mastered in business. But this wasn't a negotiation. It was the moment I faced the truth without filters. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. And only then did I realize that I was the one who needed to speak. I asked, with a coldness I had never used with anyone, if it was real. If everything I had read, seen, and felt was true. She started to cry, but it had no effect on me anymore. Those weren't tears of regret, they were tears of fear for being caught. The lover tried to defend himself, saying that things weren't what they seemed. I turned my gaze toward him and he froze. Some men understand the weight of silent rage. And in that moment, even on my worst day, I was still a CEO used to commanding respect. He lowered his head and went silent like a boy caught stealing. And I turned my eyes back to the woman I thought would be my partner for life. I asked how long it had been going on. She looked away like someone searching for an exit that doesn't exist. She said it started by accident, that she felt trapped, suffocated, misunderstood. That he made her feel alive, light, seen. Empty words, clichés that cheaters always use to justify weakness. I heard each one as if listening to an echo in a tunnel. Nothing there made sense with everything I had done for her. With everything I had given, built, offered. And that was when she said something I never imagined I would hear. Something that cut far deeper than the betrayal itself. She looked at me with a mix of anger and shame, and said that I was cold. Cold, calculating, distant, too focused on work. She said I treated her like an extension of my assets. That I only thought about money, numbers, investments. And that with him she felt desired, alive, important. I swallowed hard as she spoke, as if reciting a rehearsed speech. As if trying to blame me for her own infidelity. As if my success were a flaw. As if I were the villain of a story she herself had created. As she poured out those words, I realized something frightening. She was more concerned with justifying the betrayal than repairing the damage. It was as if everything were my fault. Her eyes held no regret, only accusation. She blamed me for being responsible, stable, structured. The lover behind her nodded in agreement as if he were some kind of sage. He, who had nothing, felt entitled to compare himself to me. Considered me inferior for not living life intensely as he claimed to do. I watched the two of them trying to defend the indefensible. And at that moment I realized I was facing two people living a cheap fantasy. The humiliation continued when the lover decided to speak. He said she deserved something more real. Something outside the chains of money. He spoke as if he were a poet, but he sounded like a con artist trying to impress. I looked at the luxury watch he admired on social media. A watch that cost more than the car he drove. And I wondered how many times he had wished to be me while speaking badly about me to her. That bitter irony hit me like an invisible punch. I remained silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was finally seeing everything with absolute clarity. When she realized I wasn't reacting, she tried to twist the situation even further. She said I had let her slip away. That I was absent. That I didn't make her feel like a woman. She used words that felt like carefully calculated blows. Perhaps words he himself had planted in her mind. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of revolt and pity. Pity because she couldn't see the obvious reality. I was the only solid pillar of that entire life. And she was falling for the fantasy of a man who lived off appearances. Even there, vulnerable, she seemed to believe she was right. She believed she had found true love. Something no amount of money could buy. Something more free, light, and spontaneous. And I listened to everything, analyzing it the way a storyteller analyzes a lost character. She wasn't in love with him. She was in love with the feeling of being desired by someone without responsibility. It was the childish desire to escape an adult reality. And I saw that with painful clarity. while she sank deeper and deeper into illogical justifications. She said she didn't want to go home with me, that she needed to live what she felt, that she had the right to choose something different. She spoke as if she were freeing her own spirit. I only looked at her, feeling the pain slowly turn into a new kind of coldness. The same coldness that built my empire. The same coldness that made me survive in a market full of predators. She said she loved me but didn't know if it was enough. And in that second something inside me broke forever. But along with that break, something was born that she would never imagine having to face. I walked out of that hotel without saying another word. Not because I felt nothing but because I felt everything at once. Anger, disappointment, sadness, disbelief, and a pain too big to fit in my chest. I got into the car like someone fleeing an invisible fire. My hands trembled on the steering wheel but my mind began to cool. Something inside me was slowly shifting place. The same coldness she always criticized was returning to the center. But now it wasn't business coldness. It was emotional survival coldness. And I didn't yet know it, but that would be the key to the greatest turning point of my life. That night I didn't sleep a single minute. I wandered through the empty mansion like a stranger in my own home. Every corner held memories that now weighed like bricks. The bedroom, the bed, the closets, everything seemed contaminated by the betrayal. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating with messages from her. Apologies, explanations, confused attempts to justify the unjustifiable. I didn't reply to any of them. I closed my eyes and did something I hadn't done in years. I stopped thinking about numbers and began thinking about myself. And that silent pause completely changed the direction of my next steps. The next day I arrived at the office far too early. Even before the first directors entered the room. I gathered contracts, spreadsheets, projections, everything I had put in the background. I funneled all the pain into absolute focus. Every decision began to be made with even greater precision. I cut weak investments, ended partnerships that added nothing to me. I took risks I would never have dared to take before. My brain operated in a state of brutal clarity. It was as if the pain had scraped away all distractions. And all that remained was sharpened ambition and a hunger for growth. With her no longer at home, the silence was no longer muffled by expectations. It was now an open field for reconstruction. I started sleeping at the office some nights. I worked like I had never worked before. While she lived the illusion of new love, I revived my essence as a builder of empires. The same hunger that pulled me from zero returned in full force. I didn't want visible revenge. I wanted silent, solid, unquestionable victory. I wanted to grow in a way she would never be able to ignore. Within a few months, my investments began to explode. A company that had been on the verge of bankruptcy became a market powerhouse. A risky bet overseas became a headline in financial portals. My net worth jumped in a way even my analysts hadn't predicted. Meetings became more aggressive, more strategic, more profitable. I began playing at even bigger tables, where only those with the stomach to lose and the mind to win are allowed in. And I was willing to do anything to win. Not out of hate, but out of inner reconstruction. Meanwhile, her image in high society began to crack. Invitations diminished. Events started happening without her name on the guest list. The absence of my last name beside hers made a difference. Doors that once opened easily began to close discreetly. I observed everything from afar in silence. Without celebrating, without lamenting. Simply understanding that the elite world is merciless with those who lose their pillar. And she had just knocked down the greatest one of all. Without even realizing the magnitude of the fall that was beginning. My name, on the other hand, gained even more strength in the market. I began to be invited to international boards. Foreign funds competed for my presence in closed-door meetings. Business magazines featured my face as a symbol of resilience and strategic coldness. Some said I had become even more dangerous to the competition. I smiled less, spoke less, and earned more. Pain made me silent but extremely efficient. There was no longer any room for romanticism in decisions. Only results, growth, and dominance. And I felt that I was reaching a level I had never reached before. Inside me, something also began to heal. Not in the form of forgetting, but of repositioning. I stopped seeing myself as the betrayed man, and began to see myself again as the builder of futures. That young CEO who accepted no limits. I looked in the mirror again without seeing fragility. I saw someone tougher, more focused, more prepared. Loss had turned into fuel, and I was burning that fuel at the highest possible rate. Without knowing that, while I was rising brutally, she would begin to fall just as intensely. The consequences of her choices began to appear slowly, almost discreetly. Small rumors, isolated comments, subtle changes in her standard of living. Nothing was explicit yet. But the castle of illusions was starting to show its first cracks. I kept moving forward without looking back. Deals closed, assets multiplied, power consolidated. But somewhere in the city, the fairy tale she had chosen was beginning to lose its shine. And this story, which until then seemed separate from mine, was about to cross my path again. In a way neither she nor I could have imagined possible. Months after the separation, news about her began to reach me without me asking for it. At first they were just loose comments at business events. "Have you heard about your ex?" someone would ask cautiously. I would simply listen, showing no interest at all. But the stories began to repeat themselves far too often to be ignored. The luxury that once surrounded her was disappearing. International trips had ceased. Expensive restaurants were replaced by discreet places. The elite social circle began to dissolve quickly. And the shine she once displayed started to fade in silence. The lover, who once presented himself as a powerful man on social media, began to disappear. The luxury cars he used to post no longer appeared. Photos in five-star hotels vanished. Trips were replaced by vague messages about a difficult phase. Until the truth began to leak through the backstage of high society. He was in debt. Owing banks, investors, dangerous people. The money that sustained that life of appearances had never been his. It was a house of cards supported by lies and favors. And now that house was collapsing in front of everyone. She began to feel the real weight of it when the collections arrived. Cards blocked. Overdue bills. Doors that once opened automatically began to slam shut in her face. Events where she had once been a guaranteed presence stopped responding to her requests. The last name that sustained her socially was no longer beside hers. And the man who promised her freedom began to show only despair. Constant arguments, accusations, fear stamped on his face. The illusion of true love began to crumble. And reality demanded a price far too high. That was when, after a long time, my phone rang with her name on the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds as if facing a ghost. I ignored the first call. Ignored the second. On the third, a message came, "We need to talk." Hours later, another, "Please." And later still, "I was wrong." Those 3 words weighed more than any contract I had ever signed. I no longer felt anger. I felt only a calm, cold, definitive emptiness. Days later, she appeared at the reception of my company. Without warning. Without glamour. Without private security. Without imported cars. Just her, in simple clothes and with a look I barely recognized. The confident gaze of the high society woman was gone. In its place were fear, shame, and contained desperation. When they told me she wanted to see me, I took a deep breath. I authorized her entry without any hurry. I wanted to look into her eyes with the clarity I had lacked before. She entered my office like someone stepping onto unstable ground. Her eyes swept across the luxurious environment, now even more grand. My larger desk, new paintings, contracts stacked. Everything screamed growth. She took a few seconds before speaking. Her hands trembled. Her voice came out low. She apologized. She said she had been manipulated. She said she had lost herself. She said that only now had she understood who I truly was. She began to cry when she realized I wasn't reacting. She said the lover was bankrupt. That he had been evicted. That he now accumulated unpayable debts. That the promises of a new life had turned into constant fear. That she was living at a level she had never imagined for herself. That everything she had was gone along with the wrong choice. That she missed the security, the stability, the respect she had by my side. And then came the sentence I already knew I would one day hear. She said she wanted to come back. I calmly stood up from my chair. I walked to the glass window overlooking the city. I observed that sea of buildings I had conquered with work and cold blood. And I thought of everything I had lived since the day of the discovery. The pain, the shock, the sleepless nights, the brutal reconstruction. I turned back to her with the expression she had always called cold. But now that coldness was lucidity. I told her she was not sorry for the betrayal. She was sorry for the consequences. And those are completely different things. She tried to justify herself once again. She tried to convince me that love still existed. She spoke of starting over, of forgiveness, of a second chance. But nothing she said broke through the wall I had built inside myself. I was no longer the man who waited awake in the mansion. I was no longer the husband who did everything to please. I was someone who had learned, in the worst possible way, the true value of his own dignity. I looked at her without hatred, without contempt. Only with the firmness of someone who does not accept going backward. And I understood that that meeting was only the end of a cycle that was already dead. In the end, I learned that not every love survives when placed beside vanity. Some people don't want to build, they only want to enjoy the benefits. She had stability, respect, security, and a solid future in her hands, and traded it all for empty promises. I lost a wife, but I gained something far greater: clarity, strength, and self-respect. Today, when I look back, I feel no hatred. I feel relief for not having continued beside someone who confused luxury with character. How many people today are in relationships only for what the other person can offer? And how many are, without realizing it, betting their own happiness on an illusion? Would you forgive a betrayal like this? Would you go back after everything that happened? Write in the comments what you would do in my place, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.